I worked as a dispatcher for a pretty small ambulance station near a fairly large city in the middle of the US, and I'm going to tell one of the craziest stories I have from this job. We had a patient who we will call Susan. She was a dialysis patient, and one of the services we offered was to take very unwell or disabled patients to and from these dialysis appointments. She lived with her son, who we will call David. He was in his late 40s, and his mother, Susan, in her late 70s or so. Every week, like clockwork, we would have a unit bring Susan to and from her dialysis treatments 3 times a week. Everyone knew her at the station because we had been doing this for quite some time with Susan. We were all familiar with her and her son, whether it was the crew seeing her in person and taking care of her, or speaking to her or her son on the phone frequently about the appointments as I had done. Everyone knew her. Naturally, when crews had news about her health, they would report back to keep everyone in the loop with how she was. At one point, she was not feeling well at all, but she wanted to go to her dialysis appointment, so we obliged and took her in. At this appointment, while receiving dialysis treatment, she lost consciousness and was promptly taken by our crew to the hospital. When it was time again for her dialysis appointment, we gave the hospital a call to see if she had been released and was able to go to the appointment. The hospital staff informed us that she would likely be released the following day and would be receiving that dialysis treatment in the hospital. Then the next treatment time rolled around and we called the hospital, and we were told she had been released from their care the other day. This was great news, but a little strange due to the fact that we were always her first call to transport her to or from any hospital or appointment, and we hadn't transported her anywhere. We quickly moved on, however, and called her son David to see if she was going to be requiring us for her treatment that day. He informed us she wasn't feeling well, and that she wasn't up to it, but that he was considering taking her back into the hospital. We tell him that if he needs us to just give us a call, and until further notice, we cancel her trip for the day. We never get a call. Next appointment rolls around and we call David again to ask if she will be going. He says she's sick and she's back in the hospital. Weird, since we hadn't taken her, but doesn't seem that off considering her health had been deteriorating. Next appointment, same thing happens. We call David, his mom's in the hospital. We move on. Now is where things took a bit of a turn. When the next appointment came up, we had tried calling David to ask about his mother's status, but he never answered or returned our calls. So being that we had a contract with Susan and were to take her to these appointments unless told otherwise, we sent a crew to collect her for treatment. When the crew arrived at scene, they knocked on the door to no response. They knocked again and were greeted by David smoking a cigarette. David seeming surprised. The crew said they were there to pick up Susan for her appointment. David responded stating he had forgotten to call, but Susan was still in the hospital not doing well. The crew gave their best wishes and David shut the door. But the crew felt like something was off. They immediately radioed to dispatch that something was wrong, and they requested we call the hospital. David said she was at to see if she was still there. The hospital had no record of her being there since we last knew. So we had the crew leave the scene and we called for a welfare check on Susan at her son's home. We heard nothing the rest of the day from police, David, Susan, or anyone else involved. The next morning I came into work and the very first call I took began with, "This is Sheriff so-and-so. I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you asked us to perform yesterday." I was nervous as he sounded concerned and I didn't really expect them to call us back with any news. He proceeded to let me know that upon arrival to the home they spoke with David, who was adamant his mother didn't feel well, but that she was home from the hospital. The police asked to just check on Susan to make sure she was all right, and eventually David obliged, letting the police in. Once entering the home, they were met with a grim scene, though I imagine they smelled it first. They continued to explain that what the officers observed was the dead body of Susan propped up on the couch wrapped in blankets, as if watching the television. But she had been dead for a while. They approximated around 2 weeks. When speaking to David, they found that he had been changing her clothes regularly and watching TV with her. Obviously, he was suffering from some sort of mental issue and grief, but the thing was, he had never taken good care of her until she was dead. No news coverage, no updates from police further than that, nothing. Stuff like this happens in your hometown, and you'll never even know most of the time. I'm a female paramedic, and this happened during my night shift about 2 months ago. We'd been running calls all night. Overdoses, a car accident, and a domestic dispute where I swear the guy was sizing me up the entire time. Nothing out of the ordinary for the job, but I'll admit, the guy's stare stuck with me longer than it should have. It was past 2 a.m. when we got dispatched to an accident off a rural highway. The details were vague. Single vehicle, possible injury. My partner and I rolled out without a second thought. As we drove, something felt off. It started earlier in the shift. I'd glance out the window and catch what I thought was the same beat-up truck lingering a few cars back. But every time I tried to focus on it, it would either turn off or vanish in the distance. I told myself I was just tired. When we reached the scene, it was pitch black. No wrecked car, no bystanders, just an empty stretch of road. It didn't feel right. I started reaching for the radio to report a no-show. That's when we saw headlights in the distance, a truck barreling toward us. But something about the way it swerved onto the shoulder made my stomach drop. The truck didn't slow down. Instead, it slammed into the side of the ambulance with a sickening crunch. The force threw me against the cabinets. My partner shouted something, but I couldn't make it out over the ringing in my ears. Before I could gather my thoughts, the truck backed up and hit us again. Harder this time. The whole rig tilted. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for help, but the signal was dead. The truck reversed a third time, revving its engine like it was winding up for a final blow. But just as it lunged forward, another set of headlights appeared from the opposite direction. A car was coming down the highway. The truck swerved at the last second, its tires kicking up gravel, and sped off into the darkness. By the time the police arrived, the only evidence of what happened was the crumpled side of the ambulance and some tire marks in the dirt. They never found the truck. And that stare from earlier? I swear it was him. Now, every time I'm on a night shift, I can't help but check the mirrors. I'm always waiting to see that truck creeping around somewhere. I've been an EMT for 6 years, and in that time, I've seen just about everything. Car crashes, house fires, heart attacks in the middle of grocery store aisles. But this call still keeps me up at night. It was a slow night. My partner, Jess, and I were parked in our usual spot, sipping coffee and listening to the police scanner. That's when we hear the call came in. Possible pedestrian struck. Male, late 30s, walking along Route 46, blood visible. We pulled onto the highway. The road was empty, eerily so, and the drizzle from earlier had turned into a misty fog. After a few minutes, we spotted a man limping along the shoulder. His shirt was torn, and a dark stain spread across his chest. I slowed the rig as Jess grabbed the flashlight and shined it on him, and he stopped walking, his head snapping toward. His face was pale, almost gray. He didn't wave or call out, just stood there staring. Jess rolled down her window and asked if he needed help. He didn't answer, just kept staring, his eyes flicking from Jess to me. Then suddenly he nodded once sharply and started walking toward the ambulance. Something about him set my teeth on edge, but protocol was protocol. Jess hopped out to help him into the back while I stayed in the driver's seat, watching through the rearview mirror. His movements were jerky, like he was unused to his own body. When he climbed in, I swear I heard him muttering under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. Jess hooked him up to a monitor and started asking the usual questions. "What's your name? Can you tell me what happened?" No response. He just stared at her, then slowly turned his head to look directly at me through the rearview mirror. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. A chill ran down my spine. His vitals were all over the place. Before she could finish, the man let out this low, guttural sound. It wasn't a scream or a groan, more like an animal growling. Then he lunged forward, grabbing at Jess's wrist. I slammed on the brakes, the ambulance skidding slightly on the wet road. Jess managed to twist away and scramble to the front of the rig. I turned in my seat, ready to intervene, but the man wasn't coming after her. He was crouched on the gurney, his head cocked to one side, watching us like a predator. We grabbed the radio, calling for backup to help get him restrained. Before I could get a word out, he moved. Fast. Faster than anyone that injured should have been able to. 1 second he was on the gurney, The next, he was at the back doors. With a strength that didn't match his wiry frame, he kicked them open and leapt out, rolling onto the asphalt like it was nothing. I threw the ambulance into park and ran after him, Jess close behind. But by the time we got to the road, he was gone. Just gone. The fog swallowed him up, leaving no trace. Jess and I stood there, stunned, our breaths visible in the cold air. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. We radioed it in, and soon the highway was crawling with cops, flashlights combing the darkness. They didn't find anything, not a single trace of him. No blood, no footprints, nothing. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We wrote up our report, filed it, and tried to shake it off as just another weird encounter. By the end of my shift, I was exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. When I got home, I threw my gear onto the couch and headed for the shower. The hot water helped, but not enough to chase away the unease. I kept replaying his face in my head. I was toweling off when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the living room. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but when I stepped out of the bathroom, the sound got louder. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from my gear bag. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. The thumping stopped as I reached down and unzipped the bag. My radio was on, even though I'd turned it off before leaving work. Static filled the room, followed by a faint, whispering voice. The radio cut off, leaving me in silence so thick I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. I looked around. Every shadow in my apartment suddenly felt alive. And then, just as I turned toward the door to check the locks, I saw a figure streak across my living room and bolt out the front door. I called the police. They found a smeared, bloody handprint on the front door, but that was it. They filed the report, and I haven't heard any updates since.